Okay, everybody's ready to make it through at least another hour. Hour and a half.
All set. Thank you. So if we could bring up that portion of 151, please. And just for the record, I think I'll restate, we've had this up in the past. It was part of a large confidential package, but we agreed that this email was not confidential. So kind of set the stage. Mr. Nyland, you've seen this email before. We've discussed it before, correct?
Yes.
So I discussed it with Mr. Hardy, and you were here when I was discussing with him, correct?
Yes.
So just to kind of set the stage, at the top, it's from Kenneth Parkhill to Ryan Hardy and you and others, but it started below that with an email from Ryan Hardy to you and Ken Parkhill with copies to others at PA, correct?
Yes.
And it's October 4th, 2017, correct?
Yes.
And so Ryan is responding primarily to you and to Kenneth Parkhill. And he says, John, below are some recommended questions for ISO and E as part of the correct decision. Do you see that?
Yes.
So how did this email come about? Did you ask Ryan to put together some recommended questions for ISO?
Actually, it may have been Ken asking Ryan for just some thoughts, and I think this is, Ryan, sort of playing a devil's advocate. Should we get into a discussion with the ISO? Points that could be brought up.
Okay. And his first recommended question was based on our experience before the Rhode Island EFSB and NTE Killingly's experience before the Connecticut Siting Council. It appears that the applicable state permitting boards are unlikely to approve the construction of new natural gas plants without having secured a CSO through an FCA. Do you see that?
Yes.
And were you here when Mr. Hardy said that he didn't think that that first sentence was actually true?
I thought when he said that he was, maybe expressing an opinion, that wasn't a view that we shared, Invenergy shared, but I think that was my recollection of what he said.
What is your opinion? This sentence that I just read, do you think that sentence is true? Is it accurate?
No, I don't think it's true. I think the siting board is a different goal, a longer term evaluation of need. The CSO may be a part of it, but yeah, that's not a view that I think that we would agree with.
What about, it really makes two references, one to this board in Rhode Island, and the other one to the Connecticut Siting Council regarding Killingly, correct?
Yes.
Would you agree that certainly, it appears to me that the statement with regard to Killingly is in fact accurate, because in Connecticut they turned down the license because they didn't have a CSO, correct?
I think so. I know, PA was assisting, that project as well, so they would have more intimate knowledge on that proceeding.
Right. Did you have a meeting subsequent to this email with ISO?
No.
Did you ever talk to anybody at ISO on the phone about this subject of this email?
No.
Any email exchanges regarding the subject of this email?
No.
So you never communicated any of these recommended questions to ISO? Any?
No.
And do you know if the same is true for Mr. Parkhill? Did Mr. Parkhill ever communicate any of this to ISO?
I don't think anybody at Invenergy had a discussion with ISO after, it relates to the disqualification of Unit 2 for FCA 12. When they disqualified us, that was it.
The third question, the first sentence says, the integration of new resources subsidized by state-level policy initiatives is having a downward impact on capacity pricing. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember what Mr. Hardy testified about that?
Yeah, you're getting a little outside of my bandwidth in terms of, in terms of what policies, certainly something that Mr. Hardy is much more of an expert than I am. But I do believe he spoke to, I think they call it CASPER, state-sponsored resources. That I think that's an ongoing issue for the ISO.
Going back to the first question, when you received this email from Ryan, did you have any discussions internally at Invenergy regarding the recommended questions?
Not that I recall.
Any exchange of emails or phone calls, anything like that?
No.
I note that on the top, what appears to have happened, because looks like Ryan Hardy sent his email to you and to Ken Parkhill on October 4th at 12:28, and then at the top, the email from Mr. Parkhill to Ryan Hardy and to you is that same day, exactly 2 hours later at 2:28 p.m. Do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, you scroll up, I can see it.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Parkhill's reaction to Mr. Hardy's suggested questions is, thanks for the good questions, Ryan, correct?
Yeah. I think he's being polite.
Okay.
We'd already had our disqualification notice at that point in time, so it was kind of, thanks for the questions.
Okay. All right. Again, hard shift. Do you recall during the planning board process that the Barville Police Department sent a letter to the planning board with some requests that they'd like to see in the event the plant gets permitted?
I recall there was a letter. I can't recall the specifics of it.
All right. If I showed you the letter, would you know whether or not you'd seen it before?
I think so.
For the record, I've just handed Mr. Nyland, and he's taking some time to review it, a memorandum from the Barville Police Department, which has been marked for ID as Town Exhibit 50. And it's to the Town of Barville Planning Board, Thomas Kravitz, the town planner, Michael Wood, the town manager, from Colonel Stephen J. Lynch, Chief of Police, dated May 18, 2016. And if you could let us know when you've refreshed your recollection on this, I'd appreciate it. Yes, if you don't mind, I'd like to move it full at this time.
No objection.
Okay, submitted full. Town 50, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So you've seen this before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the second paragraph, it's a series of requests from the Chief of Police regarding consideration with regard to the police department's responsibilities in the event the Clear River Energy Center would be constructed, correct?
Yes.
And so in the second paragraph, it appears the first thing they've asked for is notification of any incidents which impacts the community, the safety of the community, the employees there. So have you thought about whether or not Invenergy will be in a position, if the plant gets built, to provide some sort of notification system of...
instant notification.
I'm sorry, yes, incident notification. Yes, it's instant incident notification. Do you have a system like that at any plants that you've been responsible for?
In my experience, projects like this will have an emergency action plan in which they'll have, numbers, emails, whatever, people to contact in the event of an incident. And, the staff on site will be trained, in terms of the procedures that would have to be conducted. And they would also, conduct training with, the local fire and police to make sure that everybody's, has the proper coordination.
So is Invenergy committed to coming up with a system that would provide the fastest possible notification system to the police department and the town of any such incidents?
Yes.
So the next paragraph talks about annual training events and includes a number of suggestions, active shooter scenarios, facility sabotage, etc. And that these annual training events would be the financial responsibility of, correct? Is Invenergy committed to that?
Yes.
Going to the next page, the top of the next page, the Borough Chief is concerned that the facility be manned on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis with on-site security personnel. Do you know if that's the plan?
Well, it'll be manned 24/7, and portions of the operating staff, will be, there'll be a gate that'll be remotely monitored from the control room. So they won't be necessarily, security personnel per se, but they'll be trained in terms of controlling access to the site and, who to contact in the event of an emergency.
But you won't have a security person on site?
I don't think during operations, no. There's not somebody who's dedicated, security guard. At least that's not my experience.
Okay. And you're not willing to do that at this facility?
I don't think it's necessary. I think the surveillance and the communications that we'll have, the close coordination with the police department and the fire department, I think will be sufficient.
All right, well, it goes on to talk about asking for state-of-the-art video surveillance that allows the police department to monitor remotely. Do you see that?
I do.
Is that the kind of surveillance that you're talking about?
I think the surveillance I'm talking about is, internal to the project, where you can, from the control room, monitor, the access road, the entrance, things of that nature.
What about setting it up so that the police department with a password could log in and monitor remotely?
Yeah, that may be possible. Certainly within the capability of the technology.
Okay. Then there are some arrows down below that. The first arrow talks about adding 2 SUVs to the Borough Police Department's fleet. Would that be something Invenergy would consider?
Yes.
The next one talks about 2 additional ATVs, all-terrain vehicles.
Yes.
You'd consider that. Next one talks about a canine program. Would you be willing to consider that?
Yes.
The Fall River water supply agreement, you familiar with that?
With Ben?
Yes, with Ben, between Ben and the city of Fall River.
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
That agreement was signed in August of 2017, correct?
Subject to check.
And that agreement was not included in the previous filings of the revised water supply plan with the board, correct?
Subject to check, yeah, I think so.
Now, the Johnston water agreement was between Invenergy and the town of Johnston, correct?
Yes.
But the Fall River water agreement is between Fall River and Ben Trucking, correct?
Yes.
Is there any particular reason why Invenergy chose to go that way rather than, and by that way I mean with an agreement between Fall River and Ben rather than an agreement between Fall River and Invenergy?
Well, Ben has a number of other municipal suppliers that are listed confidentially in their agreement. So the thought was to include, Fall River in that listing.
But Ben will also be getting the water from Johnston, correct? If that gets approved, correct?
Right, that's correct.
But that agreement is between Johnston and Invenergy, so I'm just trying to figure out what the difference is and what the rationale
It was just, part of the listing of the additional, sources of water that are included in the Ben agreement.
Okay.
Those are the, we called them the contingent sources, so it's just an additional contingent source that was subject to an agreement.
Okay. You're aware that the Fall River agreement is for 3 years after commencement of operations with 2 renewal options subject to consent of the city?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall that the contract in Fall River was passed on a 2-to-1 vote?
Subject to check.
Okay. Do you recall that in 2018, the Watuppa Water Board chairman stated that the board is not in favor of renewing the contract?
Again, I'd have to say subject to check.
Okay. It sounds familiar though, doesn't it?
I think so.
And with regard to the Johnston agreement, I assume you're still waiting for a decision from the Superior Court as to whether or not the Johnston water contract is legal?
That's my understanding.
If the Superior Court rules that it is not legal, if you know, is it the plan of Invenergy to appeal that to the Supreme Court?
It's beyond me.
All right. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Caught me by surprise.
I told you. Today's the day.
I have a few. I think that's the operative phrase. All right, I'm gonna read from my notes first, Mr. Nyland. A number of the topics that Mr. McElroy covered with you. Then I have a few additional things that I want to cover with you that are within the scope of what he asked you. So let's start first, because it's numbered 1 in my notes, going back to the original application, which I believe is our Exhibit 1A. And Mr. McElroy had directed your attention to Section 3.1, page 7. Where you had said, or where the application says, once CREC is awarded an FCO, Invenergy will construct the project. Do you remember that?
Yes.
All right. And is it Clear River or Invenergy's position that this project won't be constructed without a CSO?
No.
So is it Invenergy or Clear River's position that regardless of whether or not this project receives a CSO, assuming all permits are obtained, this project will be constructed and will operate?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Mr. McElroy asked you some questions about some correspondence with the Burleville Land Trust. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And they were asking for access to evidently conduct their own biological inventory, or what appeared to be, including at least one reporter. Do you recall seeing those?
Yeah, it had 2 reporters, yes.
Okay. I'd like to direct your attention to another public comment from Burrillville Land Trust, and it's dated September 14, 2016. We don't have hard copies here, but I believe we can pull it up. And it's in the record of this proceeding. Can we pull that up? Okay, and I've taken the liberty of highlighting what I'd like to go over with you. So you see the upper right hand, it's September 14, 2016, which is after the materials that Mr. McElroy went over with you.
Yes.
All right. And if we go to the second paragraph that I highlighted there, you see the Burrillville Land Trust respectfully submits our preliminary report regarding biodiversity and land use issues for the Invenergy project. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recall seeing this public comment at some time in the past?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
It's not coming right to the front of my mind.
Okay. Let's go to the next paragraph and a little bit, well, you can see what I've highlighted, so I'll just read it for you. During our review of the advisory opinions, we will specifically draw your attention to the State Guide Plan, Rhode Island Land Use 2025, the State Wildlife Action Plan, the Forest Management Plan, State's Priority Forests, Protecting Our Land Resources, a Land Acquisition and Protection Plan for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Ocean State Outdoors, Blackstone Region Water Resources, Rivers Policy, the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, and the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan for Narragansett Bay, to name a few. Do you know individually or collectively what those materials are?
I know what, I've seen the Wildlife Action Plan, it's been referred to here. Rhode Island Land Use 2025 is vaguely familiar. Some of the other, I'm sure the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management Protection Plan, I think is, if I'm reading that right.
Okay. So you've been here through, I think, all of the proceedings. You've heard at least some of these materials mentioned throughout the course of this proceeding.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So let's go to the bottom of this page then. And the author of this, it's the sentence that starts, but all of these plans and policies guide planners, town managers, town councils, planning and zoning boards, land trusts, and more towards making scientific and holistic decisions and approaches to siting development within a given area. Do you have any reason to disagree with that sentence?
No.
All right, next I've got, all right, this was the page 22 of the 2019 ISO report. That was the regional electricity outlook. Remember, Mr. McElroy asked you about the one page?
Yes.
All right. Can we pull up the full report, please? And I believe we've agreed, Mr. McElroy, that this is admitted in full?
Yes.
Okay.
And I will be sending copies to the board.
Okay.
And what's the date? Is it March of this year?
It is March 2019, Director Quick. So, hot off the presses. So if we go to page 3, please. That's page number 3. There you go. Okay. And then I want to read for you and ask you a couple of questions about this. This is starting at the top, about the middle of that paragraph. You see where it says, but for the foreseeable?
Yes.
All right. But for the foreseeable future, the region will remain vulnerable to energy shortfalls and wholesale price volatility as more and more resources with limited energy inventories, natural gas generation, wind, solar, battery storage, displace resources with on-site fuel that can sustain operation for extended periods. Oil, coal, nuclear, or dual fuel generation. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Next. It's not that the region's resource mix is changing, but the way this change is happening that's challenging reliable system operations and competitive wholesale electricity markets. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Next. Conventional generators that can sustain energy production continuously for days or weeks throughout severe winter weather are retiring because they can no longer financially compete in the markets. Yet these resources are needed to perform when natural gas generators and renewable resources cannot. While battery storage is promising, current technology is limited by the quantity of energy stored and, therefore, is useful only for shortage events that last a few hours. Severe winter weather conditions can also hamper resupplies of oil and LNG, and increasingly strict emissions regulations limit how often generators run on oil. These energy constraints mean the ISO has to operate the grid on a thin margin. To date, our operators have been able to manage through periods of energy constraints, but we are concerned that in the future, this may not always be possible, and we'll have to rely on costly measures to stabilize the power system and avoid blackouts. Based on your experience here, do you agree with those statements?
Yes.
Let's go to the page numbered 17 of this same report. Here's a long one again, in 3 paragraphs. I'm going to read them for you one at a time. And it's a section entitled, Lower Emitting Resources Supply Most of the Region's Electricity. The region's energy capacity and ancillary, paren, regulation and reserves, close paren, markets have attracted more than 500 companies that compete to sell, buy, and transport wholesale electricity and other grid-related services. In 2018, natural gas-fired generation, nuclear, other low or no emission sources, and imported electricity, mostly hydropower, provided roughly 99% of the region's electricity. Based on your knowledge, do you agree with that statement? Those
Yes.
statements? Okay. Next paragraph. With low-cost fuel from domestic shale deposits, advances in, let me stop there for a moment. Do you know where those shale deposits exist?
In Pennsylvania and Texas and out west.
With low-cost fuel from domestic shale deposits, advances in technology, and smaller generators that are easier to site, subject to a lengthy permitting process, natural gas-fueled power plants have proliferated in New England over the past 2 decades. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Market participants have invested billions into new, efficient, paren, meaning they use less fuel, relatively low-emitting natural gas-fired generation. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And does that describe Clear River?
Yes.
Nearly half of the region's electric generating capacity uses natural gas as its primary fuel, paren, about 15,000 megawatts, close paren. And natural gas-fired power plants produce about 40% of the grid electricity consumed in a year. Based on your knowledge, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Next paragraph. Until electric storage or other technologies have the ability to supply quick energy for longer periods and in greater quantities, flexible natural gas resources are a necessary element of the hybrid grid, not only to help supply the quote-unquote missing energy when the weather is uncooperative for wind and solar resources, but also to provide the precise grid stability and reliability services that renewables generally cannot. However, natural gas delivery constraints in winter caused by high demand for this fuel from both the heating and electric power sectors can prevent these resources from filling this need during the cold weather. The need to meet environmental requirements can also restrict the amount of time natural gas plants that use oil as backup can run. And That's been a subject of extensive discussion in this proceeding, correct? Those concepts?
Yes.
All right. Then let's go to page 18. This section is entitled, Markets Respond to Changing Times, Less Efficient Resources Retire. In contrast, aging coal-fired, oil-fired, and nuclear power plants are closing largely because their fuel and environmental mitigation costs make them too expensive to effectively compete against natural gas-fired generators and growing levels of renewable energy resources that have no fuel costs, low operational costs, and incentives designed to lower their initial capital investments. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
More than 5,200 megawatts of oil, coal, and nuclear power plants will have retired from 2013 to 2022, and another 5,000 megawatts of coal and oil-fired generation could be retiring in coming years. As far as you know from what you've seen with respect to the ISO's projections, do you agree with that?
Yes.
The region's remaining two nuclear facilities, in Perens, Millstone, and Seabrook, which produce a combined 3,300 megawatts, will be critical components of the hybrid grid because they are carbon-free and have a dependable on-site fuel supply. Nuclear power currently supplies a quarter of the grid electricity consumed in the region per year. As far as you know, is that correct?
Yes.
And going past the one page, page 22, that Mr. McElroy called your attention to, let's go to page 28. And it's the lower left-hand corner. It's the section titled Helping Lower Costs for Congestion, Uplift and Reliability Agreements. Transmission system upgrades have contributed to striking decreases in congestion costs in the New England energy market. Let me stop there. Do you understand what congestion costs are?
Yeah, when an area is like southeastern New England, SENE zone is import constrained, you can have higher costs in that constrained zone as compared to surrounding zone, and that can be termed a congestion cost.
All right. And I don't know if you recall this or not, I covered this with Mr. Walker, what seems like years ago. We were talking about the ABB report, which used to be known as the Ventix report. And you recall that ABB was predicting that the SENE zone would, starting with FCA 14, break out, or that its costs would be higher than the rest of the ISO New England market. You recall that?
Yes.
And that's what you just described here?
Yes.
All right. So I'm just going to start again because I forgot where I left off. Transmission system upgrades have contributed to striking decreases in congestion costs in the New England energy market and have, with the aid of low natural gas prices and other factors, helped drive down and mitigate, in quotes, uplift payments to run specific generators to meet local reliability needs. Do you know what uplift payments are?
I think in this case they're talking about a payment like they would make to Mystic for what they call I forget the term they call it. They used to call it an RMR agreement, but yes.
And what you're referring to is the $400 million that's going to be paid to Exelon to keep Mystic 8 and 9 running after Exelon announced that it was going to close it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Additionally, since 2010, the ISO has not had to rely on special reliability contracts with older, less efficient generating resources in weak areas of the transmission system. Do you know what they're talking about there?
Yes. In my experience, when I worked with NRG, they were providing those uplift RMR type payments to a couple of facilities that NRG owned. Norwalk was one of them. It was in the Southwest Connecticut zone.
You've said it. We're done with this one. You said several times, both today and I believe last week, and I think at least a couple of times it was in response to a question from Director Coit, that the useful life of this proposed facility is something on the order of 40 years, you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. And then Mr. McElroy earlier today asked you some questions about the Salem Harbor plant. Remember those?
The footprint plant?
That's what you want. Footprint is Salem Harbor, is that correct?
Yeah, it's called footprint. It's
Right.
the old plant that was there before it was called Salem Harbor. It's in Salem Harbor.
And I know that he's not the only one. Mr. Elmer had asked you some questions about that. I believe Mr. Marcaccio also asked you some questions about footprint last week. And I believe it was Mr. Elmer who walked you through what might be similarities and differences between the footprint facility and the Clear River facility. So let me see if I can cover all of these quickly so we can be done well before 5 o'clock. Both facilities are combined cycle.
Yes.
Both facilities, you thought last week the footprint was a 2x1. Do you now know that footprint is a 2x2, just like Clear River would be?
Yes, I went back and looked at it. It is a single shaft configuration with 2 units.
Okay. And that's reflected in OER Exhibit 4, which is the footprint order that's in evidence?
Yes.
How many megawatts is footprint, if you can recall?
675, I want to say.
Okay. Where does footprint, footprint's not dual fuel, correct? That's one of the differences?
That's correct.
Where does footprint get its natural gas supply?
It has a lateral that is connected to an Enbridge pipeline. It's called the hub line, which goes from Weymouth to Beverly out through, basically Boston Harbor and Massachusetts Bay.
And is that a line that was existing when footprint was built?
I think it was built just prior to that. I'm not actually sure when that line was built, but the connection, the lateral, it's an undersea connection that they have that they built specifically for footprint.
Do you know how long it is?
I think it's like 1.2 miles. It goes under the harbor and it also goes under a portion of land.
Bilateral and line, are you speaking of a pipeline?
It's a pipeline. It's a 16-inch diameter pipeline that connects into the hub line, which I think might be 24 inches, and connects to the plant.
Both plants, footprints uses GE gas turbines?
Yes, it's the 7FA.05, which was sort of the predecessor to the H technology. That's why it doesn't produce as much power. It's not as efficient.
So it's an older model of GE gas turbine than the one that's proposed for Clear River?
Yes.
And how do they compare in terms of heat rates?
It has a higher heat rate. It's less efficient. I would have to guess at a couple hundred BTUs per kilowatt hour higher.
I want you to guess.
Okay. I don't have the specific numbers.
Just based on the fact that it's the older GE unit, does that mean that it uses more gas to burn the same amount of electricity, or to generate the same amount of electricity?
Yes.
Is it also higher emitting, if you know, in terms of air emissions?
I don't know. But the fact that it burns more gas to produce a megawatt hour on a pound per megawatt hour basis, it would, for a similar amount of megawatts, it would have higher emissions, would be my guess.
Okay. Can we pull up OER4?
Oh, you're for
Mr. Pleaser, are you still doing the footprint questions?
I am, but please feel free to interrupt.
Well, I just wondered if, do you know of any other plants that have outside of our Reggie regional cap, do you know of any other plants that have a specific declining cap like this imposed by the settlement agreement of footprint?
Oh, any other plants that have agreed to a footprint-like agreement? You know, I thought I saw Killingly had agreed to something like that, but I can't be certain of that.
At any rate, no plants that you're familiar with in the Invenergy landscape
No.
have this.
So we have OER Exhibit 4 up there. And I think this goes back to Mr. Mercaccio, but it might be Mr. Elman. I'll tell reflected. If we could go to paragraph C5. I'm sorry, I can't follow which page. You got it there?
PDF page 33 or 32.
Thank you.
No, C5.
C's start at the bottom of that page, I think.
There we go. And I think Mr. Marcaccio had asked you about this one. And just to summarize, this paragraph provides a requirement that construction would have to commence within 3 years of the issuance of the permit that was being issued. You recall that?
Yes.
And I believe you said that on behalf of Invenergy, you don't have any issue with that, a similar requirement in this case, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now could we go to the settlement with CLF that's attached, please? Mr. Elmer had asked you some questions last week about what he said was a lawsuit that Conservation Law Foundation had filed against the developer of Footprint. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall being here back in September when Timmons Roberts testified?
Yes.
All right. And so do you recall a quote that was in the context of this footprint settlement from Bradley Campbell, president of Conservation Law Foundation, that we would much rather have a new modern combined cycle plant rather than older, less efficient facilities?
Yes.
Okay. So let's look at this settlement agreement. There are a couple of provisions that I think Mr. Marcaccio asked you about. I want to make sure we're all clear on what we're dealing with. So,
Could I just,
yes.
Footprint is the facility that was built on the footprint. I mean, no, coal plant, correct?
Yeah, the Salem Harbor plant, right.
So if we go to, we're still in this, bless you. So let's go to page, I'm sorry, okay, Joanne? All right, let's go to page 4 of the settlement agreement. And I believe Mr. Marcaccio had specifically asked you about this, and I think it was also the subject of Director Coyte's question a few minutes ago. This is the portion of the agreement that reflects the agreed upon greenhouse gas reductions over a period of years, correct?
Yes.
And I believe in response to, and again I apologize, it was either Mr. Marcaccio or Mr. Elmer, in response to one of their questions, you had indicated that from your perspective on behalf of Invenergy, either you don't have a problem with or you don't object to a permit condition or a license condition that would impose similar reductions on this facility. Is that correct?
Yeah, similar in the methodology that was used in the footprint agreement. Yes, that's correct.
So if we look at that methodology, and I don't believe this question was asked, if we could go to page 5, the very next page. If we just increase it just a little bit, so we say, and this is a section on offsets. You see that?
Yes,
Are you familiar with this?
I've read the agreement.
All right, could you explain what this is?
They're talking about, you have the previous table had an annual limit for greenhouse gas emissions, and it was based on an expected operating profile. And then with paragraph little odd I is saying, if that in any one year you don't reach that limit, you're able to offset future emissions by banking the difference.
Right.
Spell that out a little more, and particularly if people haven't read this agreement. So the table that we looked at, in 2049, the emissions are about 20% of what they would be in 2016, so 80% less.
Yes.
Presumably, if you're running the plant a lot because it's efficient and called upon, you won't, not you, this plant would not be reaching those emissions and would need offsets in order to achieve those targets.
Yeah, I think there were two offsets. These were the operating offsets that I was referring to that could be banked and carried forward into future years. And then
Farther down the page.
yeah, a little down below they talk about other offsets that you could buy if you needed to operate more. And then my sense of the intent of that was, I mean, essentially you have the most efficient or one of the most efficient power plants in the region. You wouldn't want to curtail its operation, which could in turn require a less efficient generator to take its place. I mean, that wouldn't make sense. So you'd rather have this one operating and give it a mechanism by which to do so. And this was the approach that they took in footprint.
Yeah, I think I actually jumped ahead. So you were talking about a year in which the plant would not actually produce as much as the cap.
Correct.
And you can bank those and carry them forward. And then this little 3 is about if you exceeded the cap, how you would offset in other ways.
Right. Right.
If you know, may I proceed?
Yeah.
Okay. If you know, is that concept similar to, in the context of air permitting, the purchase of emission reduction credits?
I guess. I mean, those emission reduction credits are one-time purchases that you make, and it's a way, I think, for the Department of Environmental Management or whatever, of the various states to try to control and keep a cap on it, if you will, creating new emissions. So
This is different. This would be operationally through the.
this is operational. Yeah, that's you have to have the ERC in order to get the permit.
Okay.
And so my understanding of the ERCs, the way they work, is that there's the available pool of those is declining over time. And so, you could eventually find yourself at a point in time in the future where there are none available and you won't be able to get an air permit for this type of facility.
Okay. So when you talked, again, whether it was in response to Mr. Elmer or Mr. Mercaccio, when you talked about being able to meet the reductions that are set forth in page 4, am I correct that that was with the understanding that this whole program, which includes banking and offsets, would be part of that condition? Am I correct?
Yes.
And then one final subject with respect to this document, and it's on the next page, page 6, paragraph 2, on final shutdown and decommissioning. There we go. Now, for the record, and I assume you're aware of this, the overall document that we're looking at, OER4, the order is dated February 25, 2014. You're aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. And it's already in the record of this proceeding, but do you recall or do you know when Footprint actually commenced commercial operations?
Well, I think at the time that this was agreed to, they were supposed to commence operations in 2017. I think they were a year late, so I think they commenced in May of 2018.
All right, and that is what the record reflects. So a shutdown date as set forth here on paragraph 2 of January 2050 would be giving Footprint 32 years of operating life since they started last year. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what they would end up having. It was actually giving them, 33, I think, is when they first started.
All right. So, assuming, to try and again use Mr. Elmer's words, the hoped for commercial operation date of May 31, 2023 for this facility, if it received the same 32 years of operating life, we're talking about 2055, am I correct?
Yes.
And that's acceptable to you?
Yes.
I think, isn't the 2050 deadline consistent with the Global Warming Solutions Act, 80% reduction level by 2050?
I think that's how they selected it.
Yeah.
But again, I think, barring the unforeseen, some new technology or something coming, into existence, the thought that I had was, if you find yourself in 2050 and, this is still, one of the most efficient plants, even though, a lot of other facilities have retired, renewables are there, you may still find yourself, in a position that you'd want to have this facility. So, it's an 80%.
In other words, despite the fact that this settlement talks about shutting down in 2050?
For them, yes. I think what I was saying with respect to Clear River, it being the most efficient, that that operating on a similar time horizon of 32 years, depending upon when we start, that would be acceptable.
And just so we're clear, if we go back to page 4, which reflects the GHG reductions, am I correct that that 80% reduction is being achieved irrespective of the closure date?
Yeah, in terms of the annual cap tons per year is, I believe they put that together, showing that same sort of a reduction over time. So you're at year 50, you're at 80% of what this was originally. So I think that, complied with the Global Warming Solution Act goal.
Okay, I think we're done with this one. Chairperson Curran at one point asked you about whether capacity prices have been going down. You remember that?
Yes.
What about energy prices? Have those been going down?
I don't think so.
All right. Are you in a position, for example, to compare energy prices in ISO New England to those in PJM, where the Lackawanna facility is located?
Yeah, probably not off the top of my head. I know the capacity pricing in PJM is lower than New England.
By a factor?
I think when we cleared FCA 10 at 7, I think clearing prices, they price theirs a little differently. They're on a dollar per, I think kilowatt year basis. But if you do it, apples to apples, dollar per kilowatt month, I think PJM, their auction cleared something about half, less than half of what we cleared at in FCA 10. So it was around $3 as opposed to $7.
Okay. All right, let's switch gears now to the August 2016 PUC post-hearing brief, which Mr. McElroy asked you about. If we could pull that up, please. And then starting with paragraph number 1, Mr. McElroy read you the first sentence of that paragraph. Am I making noise? Sorry. Let's read the next 3. Given the ISO New England's expectations for large-scale retirements of existing and older generation resources, the full projected capacity proposed by CREC is needed. You still agree with that?
Yes.
CREC is also needed to support the growing needs of the renewable energy generation industry. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
CREC is further needed because it will displace older, more polluting generation in the region, thereby leading to modernization of the electric generating infrastructure, resulting in lower system heat rates and improved air quality and lower emissions. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Now let's go to page 5. And again, I want to talk about a section that Mr. McElroy skipped. Actually, I'd like to ask you about this in the context of that email that keeps cropping up, the excerpt from Exhibit 151, the one that he asked you about between you, Mr. Hardy, and Mr. Parkhill. You remember that one?
Yes.
And I'm just focusing on that first hypothetical based on our experience before the Rhode Island EFSB and NTE Killingly's experience before the Connecticut Siting Council. It appears that the applicable state permitting boards are unlikely to approve the construction of new natural gas plants without having secured a CSO through an FCA. Remember that?
Yes.
And you, at least with respect, I know you don't have any experience with the Connecticut one, but you disagree with that hypothetical with respect to this proceeding, correct?
Yes, being the sole determinant of need, that's correct.
And so now let's go back and look at this section that Mr. McElroy didn't ask you about in the PUC post-hearing brief. It's section number 4. While a capacity supply obligation is strong evidence of need, the Act does not require a capacity supply obligation or a procurement contract as a prerequisite to establish need. And then there's a discussion below that. I'm not going to ask you about the provisions of the Energy Facility Siting Act, but you understood that to be Invenergy's position as of August 2016?
Yes.
Has that position ever changed?
No.
All right, now let's go to the January 12, 2016 transcript. And it's, oh, I can't read my own writing. I think it's page 137. Yeah.
Which transcript is that?
It's January 12, 2016. It's the transcript. It's in this docket, Chairperson. And it is page 137. This is something Mr. McElroy asked you about. Lines 11 and 12, and you were talking here about, let's see, that's assuming that we have approximately a 30-month construction schedule. Remember he asked you about that?
Yes.
All right. Now, January 12, 2016 predated Invenergy's development of the Lackawanna Energy Center, am I correct? The construction of it.
Yes.
All right. And I think we covered this last week, so I'll just try and shortcut it a bit. Do you recall that Unit 1 of the Lackawanna Energy Center was completed in approximately 24 to 25 months?
Yes.
And I believe you testified to this last week as well. GE has also provided a construction duration estimate based on what is now their experience with construction of these types of units, is that correct?
Yes, yes, a single shaft machine, GE, their standard schedule is a 24-month.
Could you just, excuse me, Mr. President, could you describe the site of the Lackawanna plant and how it might be similar or different from the proposed site?
It's a level site. It was, for the most part, cleared. There was some clearing. There was a lot of earthwork that had to be done, especially subsurface work that took a number of months. So, you know, in comparison, you know, I think, you know, the clearing and grading that would be required at Clear River could be done in actually a shorter period of time and as compared to what was required at Lackawanna.
What does subsurface work entail?
The site actually had mines underneath it, old mines that had to be, portions of them had to be filled with a concrete ground. So they had to bore down and fill it up and help stabilize it. And that took some time.
Did you displace any bats?
Not to my knowledge. No.
Speaking of Lackawanna, do you know how that facility currently, excuse me, disposes of its wastewater?
I think right now it's trucking its wastewater.
To a local PLTW?
Yes.
And if I told you that the daily wastewater discharge from this facility that's dropped off site is approximately 56,000 gallons, does that sound right?
Yes.
How much would the Clear River facility generate on a daily basis? If you recall.
It's much less than that. It was a couple of trucks a week, I think, small trucks.
Am I misremembering this, but wasn't there an issue with the wastewater that, so that the trucking off-site is a solution to a problem?
At Lackawanna?
Yeah, or am I just misremembering that?
Originally, they were looking at having a discharge to a local creek that wouldn't work, and then they looked at interconnecting into the local sewer system, but it needed an upgrade, and I believe that the upgrades have been agreed to, and that is how that plant will discharge in the future.
Actually, since you're on Lackawanna, Mr. Glazer,
Sure.
I did find my notes, and this may be more for you, but I found my notes from December 5th, Mr. Hankard. I just wanted to ask one more question there. And I had in my notes that you previously had said you would make that commitment, no operations unless the plant meets the 43 dBA at the nearest residence. But also in my notes, I have Mr. Hankard talking about how noisy it is during the ramp up. I'm not sure, when the steam turbine bypass is creating all this noise up to, I have down here a bunch of different notes, but 85 dBA or so. When you were talking about that condition, are you talking about that condition about the 43 dBA being about during normal operations or including the noisy startup and cool down?
During normal operations, I don't know if this witness can testify to it or not, but Mr. Hankard and I think Mr. Hessler agreed that those startup and shutdown events, number one, don't happen that often, and number two, are of very limited duration. So what we're talking about here is normal operating modes, not emergency, or if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Add Mr. Nyland?
Yeah.
No, what we're talking about is during startup and shutdown, non-emergency, which is like a safety valve or something going off. And I think the concern that Mr. Hankard, and especially Mr. Hessler was talking about was the ability to achieve that with the bypass valves. And one of the things that we did was actually buy a specialty manufacturer that makes quiet valves. And that's, part of that, along with lagging and having other acoustical treatments, would be able to achieve that.
So with those quieter valves and the lagging and the silencers and all, you're saying that the 43 dBA would be a condition you would meet during those noisiest periods?
During startup, shutdown, and normal operation.
Thank you.
I stand corrected. All right, Mr. McElroy, this is now, I'm on your June 30, 2017 pre-filed direct, which is Energy Exhibit 58A. And he had you go through the project overview on page 4 and the description of these two trains, as you call them. Is Clearburger one project or two?
It's one project.
Is Lackawanna one project or three?
It's one project.
I believe Director Coit, or it might have been Chairperson Curran, I apologize, asked you about other plants in New England that truck water, and you had mentioned Ocean State Power.
Yes.
And I believe it's in the record, and obviously it's not year-round, but when they do truck water, you're aware that the trucking is approximately 1 million gallons per day?
Yeah, when their water consumption, there being a wet cool plant, would be far greater than ours. So when they find themselves in the position to provide makeup water via truck, it would be substantially more than what Clear River would ever do.
All right, staying on the same June 30 pre-filed, let's go to page 14. This was the discussion about, in the context of the reconfiguration auction versus deferral. And I'm looking right now at lines 10 to 12. You say here, there are explicit remedies and penalties built into the tariff for missing certain deadlines. Otherwise, a willful violation of the tariff is subject to enforcement action by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, including fines of up to $1 million a year. Was that what you were, excuse me, a day? Is that what you were talking about before? The ramifications of not meeting your capacity supply obligation?
Yes, they're severe. So, participating in the annual reconfiguration auction, the main goal was to have somebody, take on that capacity supply obligation.
Okay. Now let's go to your supplemental pre-filed December 13, 2017, which is Invenergy 58B. Thank you. And Mr. McElroy asked you questions about, on page 5, lines 20 to 29, about Invenergy's belief at that time, as of December 2017, that ISO New England would not terminate the CSO for Unit 1. You see that?
Yes.
All right. And in fact, heading into FCA 12, which was the next auction after this testimony was submitted, which occurred in February of 2018, ISO New England, in fact, did not terminate the CSO at that time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you recall that certain competitors of Invenergy, in fact, filed a proceeding with FERC requesting at that time that the capacity supply obligation heading into FCA 12 should be terminated?
Yes.
And do you recall that ISO New England opposed that effort?
Yes.
And Unit 1 participated in FCA 12 as a price taker?
Yes.
And that effort to terminate by competitors, that included, you recall that included LS Power?
I believe so. I think it was them and Calpine.
Okay. And who owns Ocean State Power?
Alice Power.
If I may have a moment, Chairperson. I'm almost done.
Are you saying LS?
LS, yeah, L period S, Power.
Let's go back to Exhibit 1, Invenergy 1A, the application. And it's page 118 of the application, which is PDF page 131. It's the section that starts, by definition, the siting of a new facility. There we go, down at the bottom. So let me read this to you, Mr. Nyland. And this is in the application filed in 2015. By definition, the siting of a new facility such as Clear River within the CNE capacity zone will enhance, all else equal, reliability within the CNE capacity zone, paren, and as such, the reliability of electric service for Rhode Island ratepayers, close paren. In addition, even under a scenario in which the CNE capacity zone has adequate capacity to meet the local reliability needs, the addition of a capacity resource within the CNE zone will still promote the overall reliability of the broader ISO New England footprint with which the CNE zone electrically interconnects, paren, and upon which it relies for a portion of its reliability needs as an interconnect system, close paren. And you'll see in the middle of that section that I just read, there's a reference to a footnote 11. And if we go down to that footnote at the bottom of the page, it says, it should be noted that local capacity requirements within transmission constrained zones can change year to year based on capacity retirements, capacity additions, load growth, and transmission topology changes. In other words, a single FCA result is not necessarily indicative of whether future reliability needs will be met within the capacity zone, a scenario that the FCM construct is designed to account for. If you understand that, could you explain it?
I think said another way, that the forward capacity auction is taking, it's sort of a one-year snapshot, and that there's a lot of moving pieces that are happening, within the course of the year, within each zone. That includes retirements, the transmission topology they're talking about is adding new transmission lines. There could be load changes, and so, you know, in essence, what that footnote is cautioning the reader against is you can't really rely on the FCA, the full capacity auction, in and of itself as the ultimate determinant of need.
Okay. And then again, has that been Invenergy's position since the filing of the application in this proceeding?
Yes.
Let's go to Invenergy 59, which is April 22, 2016, PUC testimony. This is your pre-file. On page 4, I'm going to read you a few lines, then I'm going to ask you a question, okay? So this is starting at the bottom, line 17. In 2002, the state of Rhode Island adopted the Rhode Island Energy Plan 2002, in parens, Energy Plan 2002, to help Rhode Island determine how best to meet its future energy production and consumption needs. The objective was a reliable, low-cost, and environmentally benign supply of energy to support economic growth and safeguard consumers from supply disruptions. The planning horizon for Energy Plan 2002 extended to the year 2020. You still agree with that?
Yes.
Next paragraph on the next page, starting at line 1. More recently, on October 8, 2015, Rhode Island's State Planning Council adopted the latest state energy plan, Energy 2035, Rhode Island State Energy Plan, in parens, Energy 2035, with a planning horizon extending out to 2035. Energy 2035 is described as a product of a collaborative effort over a number of years by numerous private and public stakeholders. Energy 2035 is intended to guide the activities of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources and the Division of Planning by setting goals and policies to improve energy security, cost effectiveness, and sustainability in all sectors of energy production and consumption of the state of Rhode Island. Invenergy's CREC project supports the goals and policies of Energy 2035, particularly as a means to support the rapid introduction of more renewable energy resources into the generation mix. You still agree with those statements?
Yes.
And there's a question at line 11. Please explain how the CREC project supports the goal of Rhode Island Energy 2035. And here's your answer. A reliable electricity supply is a necessity to both Rhode Island and regional economies, as recognized by Energy 2035. Any new project needs to provide updated, modern, energy-efficient electricity generation, along with other benefits such as ratepayer savings, which help support local and regional economies. Also, as described below, the CREC project is essential as a means to support the planned growth of renewable energy generation so as to provide essential generation. Due to the variability and intermittency of wind and solar energy resources, paren, the predominant renewable generation technologies being deployed, close paren. Rhode Island has few indigenous energy resources and must import most of the fuels from which its electricity is generated. Although renewables have experienced significant growth in the past few years and certainly are a planned resource for the future, renewables are not growing at a sufficient pace to fully replace the rate of retirements of older, less efficient electric generation facilities. You still agree with those statements?
Yes.
Next one. Many of these older electric generation facilities have lower energy efficiencies, do not employ modern emission controls, and/or rely solely on more polluting fuels like oil and coal. You still agree with that?
Yes.
Next. Until the total generation provided by renewables in New England, primarily wind and solar, grows to a sufficient level that will allow complete reliance upon renewable energy resources to meet the region's needs, other energy resources such as natural gas must be used to provide the bulk of the energy supply and provide a backstop energy source to balance the intermittency of renewable energy resources. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Next question. How does the ISO New England view the need for new efficient natural gas generation to support more reliance on renewable energy resources? And you answer the question, according to the independent system operator for New England's 2015 regional outlook, the ISO New England recognized the variable nature of renewable energy resources, pointing out that wind and solar resources will eventually help achieve federal and state environmental goals. Paradoxically, the operating characteristics of these renewables will increase reliance on fossil fuel-fired natural gas generators due to several realities, such as wind and solar resources can have rapid and sizable swings in electricity output due to wind speed, time of day, cloud cover, haze, and temperature changes, paren, which is why they are called variable or intermittent resources, close paren. You still agree with that?
Yes.
Next, these resources have a limited ability to serve peak load. Wind speeds can be at their highest levels in the summer, while extreme cold and ice can also hinder output. Widespread use of solar power, meanwhile, will likely shift peak net load to later in the afternoon, just as output diminishes with the setting sun. Still agree with that?
Yes.
To balance the variable output from wind and solar resources, the power system must hold more fast start capacity in reserve. The types of units that can come online quickly are typically natural gas combined cycle and combustion turbine generators. You still agree with that?
Yes.
Over time, the growth of renewable energy resources supplemented by energy storage will hopefully expand to a level that will reduce dependency on natural gas fueled electric generation. However, as the ISO New England recognized in its study, in the interim, New England states, including Rhode Island, must rely on a mix of generation technologies and energy resources to meet the needs of the region. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Energy 2035 has many goals and policies that will set the energy programs in Rhode Island for the foreseeable future. The goals of Energy 2035 to maintain the overall reliability of the energy supply within New England is emphasized by its key overall program initiatives, including increasing energy efficiency, promote the ability to allow for additional integration of renewables, policies directed to achieve reductions in greenhouse gases, and modernize the electric grid to ensure reliability is maintained. The CREC project will support each of these initiatives. As will be explained in my testimony, Invenergy's alternatives analysis considered each of these initiatives. And again, this is all quoting from Energy 2035, but I assume you still agree with all of that, correct?
Yes.
Now let's go to Invenergy 58A, which is Mr. Nyland's June 30, 2017 pre-filed direct in this proceeding. And page 15. Starting at line 6. And I'll read this again. This is section 3, Rhode Island Energy Plan. Question, please explain how CREC supports the goals of the Rhode Island Energy 2035 plan. And here's the answer. On October 8, 2015, this is similar to what you said to the PUC, Rhode Island State Planning Council adopted the latest state energy plan, Energy 2035, Rhode Island State Energy Plan, parens, Energy 2035, with a planning horizon, extending out to 2035. Energy 2035 is described as a product of a collaborative effort over a number of years by numerous private and public stakeholders. As stated in the statewide planning advisory opinion, Invenergy's CREC project supports the goals and policies of Energy 2035 particularly as a means to support the rapid introduction of more renewable energy resources into the generation mix. PUC's advisory opinion similarly concluded that CREC would support the development of renewable energy as emphasized in recent ISO New England reports. And then there's a footnote 4, and in terms of the reports, you refer specifically the 2017 Regional Electricity Outlook, which is attached to Ryan Hardy's pre-filed direct testimony. I assume you still agree with that?
Yes.
If I may have just a moment, Chairperson. No further questions.
CLF has no recross for Mr. Nyland.
OER has no questions.
Town has no further questions.
No.
I have a few, but I'm sure there'll be, that will, I'm sure that they won't take us past 5. Should I, do you, okay. The length of this licensing process has been mentioned repeatedly. Is it fair to say that some of those delays were caused, or with the agreement of Invenergy to pursue things like the water plan or the challenge to FERC?
I would agree with that. Obviously the water plan was not something that we anticipated. We entered into a letter of intent with Pasco Utility District, and they, seemingly were very excited about the prospect of getting a well cleaned up at no cost to them. That would also give them a long-term agreement. So we certainly didn't plan on their termination of that agreement. I would agree with you that the FERC filing that we made on the DAF was, that caused a delay that was self-imposed.
Well, for the water plan, it didn't work out the way you wanted to, but you did agree at the show cause hearing to have a 3-month delay while you put together and submitted a new plan.
That's true. Yeah, we needed the time in order to put together a plan, for sure.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the decommissioning agreement, and there are just a few, and I don't know that people want. Okay. First, I noted that the plan is updated every 5 years for the first 20, and then 2-year intervals after that. And since you're thinking that the useful life is 40 years or more, what's the reason for the 2-year intervals?
Well, that was something that the town wanted.
Oh.
We didn't really think it needed to be that, but that was something they were insistent upon, so we agreed to it. In essence, the nature of that plan is to develop a cost estimate associated with the dismantling of the project. And typically these projects, just due to the materials that are contained in the project, it doesn't really cost us anything to have it dismantled, because somebody would be willing to come in and salvage it, and whatever the salvage value is more than the cost of the dismantling. So you sort of just do sort of I'll call it a pulse check on that, every 5 years, and make sure that rationale still holds true.
But there would also be the cost of restoration included in the plan.
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
And actually you talk about the company shall complete an environmental site assessment as required by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management prior to commencement of construction of Unit 1, CCD 1. What is that environmental site assessment that you're referring to in this decommissioning report. If you want, I can give you a copy, but it talks about, it's page 2, paragraph 6. It talks about a few things that happened prior to the date of commencing construction. One is preparing a preliminary decommissioning report that evaluates the costs. And then that has to be in agreement with the town, and then there's a dispute resolution process, which given where we are, I wouldn't be surprised if you entered into. But it talks about completing an environmental site assessment first, required by
I think that's meant to be like an environmental, a phase 1 or a phase 2, which you just go in and characterize the site just so that you know what it is that you're dealing with.
Oh, okay, understand that. And then it does, so the preliminary decommissioning report has not been drafted yet, correct?
That's correct.
And then when would that, it talks about prior to construction, when exactly in the process would that be drafted?
Well, I think at this point it would be, we can probably draft it any time, just provide, you know, a contractor, here's a description of what the facility will look like, and, you know, have them, you know, provide an estimate. You know, as I said, you know, early on, the value, the salvage value of the equipment that's going to be included in there is going to start off rather high and then, you know, decline over time. But even, you know, at the end of its useful life, it'll still be, in our view, more than enough to cover not only the dismantling but the restoration of the site.
And then so the parties have to agree on the decommissioning report, including the amount of the potential costs. What is the typical financial instrument? Is it a bond usually that is put forth?
I think if the report shows that the cost to dismantle is, you know, greater than the salvage value, then it would be that difference that you would post to help cover that. But our expectation is that it would be the opposite.
I just want to point out again that it's not just the dismantling, it's the restoration.
Oh, yeah, no, it's all inclusive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Needless to say, I'm sure that should this go forward, the decommissioning is of vital importance to the town.
Yes.
I managed to get my other questions asked. Usually I ask things and then it means that everyone wants to ask additional questions, but I'm through the questions that I have on my list.
I think all of us are motivated to not do that.
Mr. Nunn, Director Coit asked you about the delays in this process. Kind of softball question. Were most of the significant delays attributable to problems that the applicant had with his application going forward?
Yeah, I would agree. The water plant, that was our problem. It caused more than a year delay. The DAF complaint created I think a 3-month delay. I know there were some additional delays, but I think the majority of the delays were due to the water plant.
I was just going to mention that in addition to the delays, then we had the processes around the Charlestown backup supply.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I was going to mention that. issues with and are against it. Sorry?
And the Narragansett.
Do you know, as a project manager, what did Invenergy do any additional environmental studies as recommended by a DEM?
In the DEM opinion, I'm not
Yeah, to recall the testimony that we had from particularly the DEM witnesses about recommendations for more expansive survey work at the site.
I believe you're talking about the biodiversity survey that we did.
Yes.
Where the DEM witness suggested that it could be, conducted for a longer period of time, and based on the feedback we got from our environmental contractor, they put together a program which I believe largely corresponded with the direction that RIDEM gave us in their written letter. Which did not address a lengthier period of time for conducting such surveys. So I think our experts concluded that it was sufficient.
So are you saying that DEM did not recommend that in surveying wildlife on the site that Invenergy should try to have a longer time period, perhaps overlap with another season, that there were a number of expected species present at the site that simply would not be present at the precise time that the study was done, the study that ESS did?
My recollection of the plan that we had put together that, then RIDEM provided us with a letter that we responded to, where we articulated the various aspects of the study that we did, and I thought it generally complied with what they were recommending. I don't recall that letter said anything about a longer period of time, conducting the study for a longer period of time. I know that when we, before we did the study, I think the environmental scientists were relying on, the published information that was out there, in terms of, forming their view of the potential wildlife that would be present on the site, which was what they told me was something that they typically do.
I think that's all I have. Did you have some? Any redirect? Or recross?
I hesitate, but I would like to do a follow-up to the chair's question. On DEM did issue 2 advisory opinions in this matter, correct?
Yes.
And you read those advisory opinions?
I've read them. I don't have them committed to memory.
I understand, but as part of your duties as project manager, when they were issued, I'm sure you took a look at them and went through them, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall that in both the original advisory opinion and then repeated again in the supplemental advisory opinion, DEM stated that it felt that the biodiversity survey should at a minimum extend over a full season instead of a limited period of time, and preferably over several years. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that specifically, but what I do recall was, we read that, and then we asked the environmental scientists to put together a plan, and we had asked RIDEM, for input on that plan. We commenced the study, and then RIDEM provided a letter of feedback, but in that letter it didn't talk about multiple seasons. And what I was being told by our experts was that what they typically do is, consult the industry literature and, the type of studies that we had put together, exams that we had put together, were, in their estimation, what was needed.
Let's try to do a timeline a little bit. You guys actually started the study before you got the input back from DEM in the letter, correct?
Yes.
Then you got the input back from DEM, and you wrote a letter back to them saying, we believe we've substantially met these requirements, correct?
Yeah, well, this is what we did, and here's, yes.
DEM issued its first advisory opinion before the results of the biodiversity survey were done, correct?
I think so, subject to check.
All right, and then DEM's second supplemental advisory opinion, the supplemental opinion, was issued after they had the biodiversity study that you submitted to them, correct?
I believe so.
All right, and then in the second supplemental opinion, they repeated what they said in the first, which is that it needed to go at least for a full season and preferably over several years, correct? Just after you had submitted it to them.
Subject to check, but it,
All right, and you did not follow that up by extending the survey either over a full season or over several years, correct?
that's correct.
All right, that's all I have, thank you.
I hate to do it, but I must. Mr. Nyland, you were here when Mr. Horbert from Rydom testified?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to read you a section of his testimony. And this was in response to a question from Director Coit. I'm looking at the March 20 transcript, page 226. Actually, I'll start with the director's question. So page 225, starting at line 19. This is from Director Coit. Thank you. I think I had one other question. Let me glance at this. I'm sorry. We also talked a lot about the biological inventory that Invenergy had done by ESS this morning. In terms of the wetlands application, this advisory opinion says you don't have adequate information on whether there are sustainable populations of amphibians in the vernal pools and such. Has DEM subsequently received the biological information that you need on wetland-dependent species to review for the wetland permit? Here's Mr. Horbert's answer. Well, there are two aspects to that. We have received a lot of information on inventory, and under our program, we don't ask the applicants to go to the nth degree to provide a complete biological inventory. But they do need to provide us enough so that we have something to go on with our own evaluation. The other part of that is we will be doing our own assessment of the wetlands in the area, our own assessment of what wildlife may be using or could potentially use that habitat as part of our evaluating the impacts of the project on those wetlands. So with respect to those vernal pools, we will be making a concerted effort to look at the characteristics of those vernal pools to determine whether or not they actually are supporting or could support a population of amphibians. It goes on and on and on for another page and a half or so. Ultimately, Director Coit said, and spring is coming, and witness, that's what they say anyway. And then there's a discussion back and forth about when DEM scientists will be going out to take a look at the site. And the witness said, this is now page 228, starting at line 11. Well, they've been out there several times already. I've actually been out there at least once to these specific areas, and we will certainly be going out there at least one or two other times, both as part of reviewing their revised project and again, to do our own detailed evaluation of the entire proposal once the project goes out to public notice. So as far as you know, or let me try it a different way, are you aware in the aftermath of the biological inventory that was conducted by ESS on this site, other than the letter that you've been referring to, which for the record is which is it's Invenergy Exhibit 213. Other than that letter that I just mentioned, Invenergy 213, and in general terms, what Mr. Horbert from Rydom testified to that I've just referred to. Are you aware of any other criticism, critique, questioning from RIDEM about the quality or extent of the biological inventory that was conducted by ESS?
Well, other than the supplemental advisory opinion that critiqued it?
The supplemental advisory opinion didn't critique it. It didn't mention this biological inventory at all.
Well, that's not true.
All right, well, then the record will speak for itself. So I'll accept Mr. McElroy's statement. Other than the advisory opinion, taking into account Mr. Orbert's testimony that I just mentioned, are you aware of any other critique or criticism about the extent or scope of the biological inventory that ESS conducted?
No.
In the course, you were here 2 weeks ago when Mr. Gray, testified about the impending air and wetland permits.
Yes.
Okay. And in the context of the pending wetland permit, if DEM directs Invenergy to conduct a further biological evaluation on the site, is Invenergy prepared to do it?
They didn't direct us to do that.
If they do going forward, is Invenergy prepared to do so?
Yes.
That's all I have.
Mr. Nolan, you're aware that DEM does not have the burden of proving that the proposed facility will not cause unacceptable harm to the environment?
Yes.
I don't have anything further. You may be excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nyland.
Is Ms. Lucarelli or the board or the chairperson in a position to advise council concerning deadlines on post-hearing submissions?
Before you do that, Madam Chairperson, I just would like to say that thank you for the excellent presentations and the hard work for all of the parties, and I think that the members of the public who have come to hours and days and months of meetings are also admirable. And so this marks kind of the close of one phase of the process, and I just wanted to acknowledge the hard work that's gone into it.
But I also personally, I know this may be a personal privilege, but I have never before worked with displaying things on a monitor like this, and it's been a tremendous help. It saved me a lot of time, and I want to thank Craig DeFusco, who's in the back of the room, who did an awesome job.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, now, 45 days for briefs, which I believe means they are due May 17th by 4 p.m. There's a 50-page limit on the briefs. And we will schedule open meetings after we receive the briefs. Is there, what else? Well, let's see if there's anything else first.
terms of the open meetings, just thinking of schedules, is it possible we'll actually schedule some of those dates before we get the briefs so that we can hold them on people's calendars? Thinking how everyone's calendar fills up, I think that would be prudent. And is it also safe to say that the hearing dates on April 11th and 12th will be removed from our calendars?
Are there any questions? All right, I think now we actually close the final hearing.
Before you do, I also want to thank Joanne, who is amazing.
Yeah.
And so,
Awesome performance.
I appreciate very much everybody's help in getting up to speed on these matters, and would like to thank all of the councils in this matter in helping to really inform us and asking some really great questions that take the record and have turned it from, frankly, have filled in a lot of gaps that potentially existed, have really taken some time to think about matters. But I also want to thank staff here at PUC for their assistance. That's no easy task sitting here for any of us, but in particular as staff and having to be ready to answer our questions at any moment.
Anyway, thank you very much.
I'll toss in my 2 cents. As a stranger from a strange state, which, as Mr. Burns mentioned, has a town oddly named Normal, I want to thank everybody who was involved with this, including in particular Mr. McElroy and Mr. Elmer. We had our issues, but overall, as you can tell, I've done a lot of these in states all over the country. I've rarely been involved in such a professional environment. We haven't always agreed. As chairperson, you and I have routinely disagreed. But nevertheless, I understand that this is the longest permitting process in Rhode Island history. It is certainly by far the longest one in Mike Blazer's history. And I want to just thank everybody involved, particularly Mr. McElroy and Mr. Elmer. This has been, from a trial lawyer's perspective, odd as it may seem, a lot of fun. So thank you.
I agree with Mr. Blazer. It's been nice to get to know him, and we welcome him to Rhode Island. It's been a great experience.
I don't know if everybody welcomes me.
Yes, I just have to echo that. Well, this has been some excellent lawyering. That's in and of itself enjoyable, of course. Okay, I think that now we're ready to close the final hearing. You can probably hear a tick-tock starting. Thank you all very much.
What's your verdict on today?
Friday.
We'll be talking. Huh? Sure, we'll be talking.
Yep.
And the one thing, over there.
I forgot to mention you. We're back bencher.
Go sit at your desk.
All right, don't forget.